Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. William O. Stevens. He was born and raised in West Lafayette, Indiana, the son of Purdue University professors. His passion for ancient civilizations and Latin began in high school under the guidance of his inspiring teacher, Oliver Esch. After beginning his college journey at the College of Worcester, Dr. Stevens completed his undergraduate education at Earlham, a Quaker college in Indiana, where he balanced his studies in philosophy, Greek, and Latin with varsity tennis. He earned his bachelor's degree in 1984 before pursuing doctoral studies at the University of Pennsylvania. At Penn, he studied under distinguished scholars, including Charles Kahn and Alexander Niemus, receiving his doctorate in philosophy in 1990. Dr. Stevens then dedicated 30 years to teaching at Creighton University in Omaha, where he was honored with the title of Professor Emeritus of Philosophy upon his retirement in December 2020. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. William O. Stevens.
Okay, well, let's get to it. I've had an interest in ancient philosophy and animals and environmental philosophy for a very long time. And this is an area that's not received a lot of sort of continuous, broad study in the scholarship on Stoicism. So this is something I've tried to work on for a while. Let's see what you think. So today I'm going to talk about animals in Stoicism and how they function both as examples of vice and virtue. So there are lots of texts in the Stoics in which the Stoic authors take pains to distinguish animals' capacities from our human capacities, right? And the long and the short of it is we're rational, we have logos, and they don't. We have speech and communicate with each other, and according to the ancient Stoics, they don't have that. So Seneca writes that no animal, whether wild or tamed, in general obeys reason, since nature made it deaf to advice. And then Epictetus repeats this doctrine, this mainline doctrine in Stoicism, that animals are capable of using impressions, but only we have the power to understand those impressions, to understand our sense perceptions and how we use our impressions, right? And so our power of reason is godlike, and non-human animals just don't have that capacity. So for Epictetus and other Stoics, we're much closer to the gods, to the divine, than non-human animals. Epictetus also notes that we're the only animals that blush and know shame. This is a very standard kind of strategy in all of ancient philosophy, not just Stoicism. And ever since ancient Greek thought, the strategy is to pick some sort of capacity or trait that all and only human beings have and that non-human animals lack. And over the centuries, this strategy has failed again and again and again. Right? People have argued that only human beings use tools, and then we discover chimpanzees using sticks to get termites out of logs and so forth. Humor has been cited as an exclusively human trait, be the capacity to do philosophy or art. And then, elephants have been shown how to take a paintbrush and paint paintings. So this is kind of a front strategy, but it's got a long history, right? And Epictetus also notes that, as I said, non-human animals lack the capacity to understand God's governance, so they're much further removed from the divine than we are. So for shorthand, this is a little turn of phrase. I'm going to use nanimals to refer to non-human animals because it's a little less clunky. It sounds weird, but you get used to it, right? So philosophers actually disagree whether human beings are animals or not. There's a real debate among philosophy scholars about whether human beings are animals or not, which is kind of indicative of the state of the art in philosophical work these days. So that said, Stoics also recognize that animals are a lot like us. So Marcus Aurelius writes, and things that share an intelligent nature are just as prone to seek out what is like them, if not more so, because their superiority in other ways is matched by their greater readiness to mix and mingle with their counterparts. Even in irrational creatures, we see swarms, herds, the feeding of young, and love not unlike ours, because they do have souls and their body and instinct is found in a developed form. We don't see this in plants or stones or trees. And it's still more developed in rational beings with their communities, friendships, families, assemblies, their treaties and truces. But that said, again, the more common pattern in Stoic authors is to uphold nanimals as exemplars of vice, of bad behavior, right? So here's some examples of texts that articulate that notion that beasts are vicious. Epictetus writes, kinship with the body is the reason why some of us have gravitated in that direction, becoming like wolves, deceptive, cunning, and pernicious. And others like lions, fierce, brutal, and wild. Well, most of us are foxes and other forms of wretched animal life. I mean, isn't fox the perfect description of a scurrilous and malicious person, unless he's some lower and more wretched creature? So be careful and make sure that you don't turn out to be one of these wretched creatures, right? So there he's given examples of 3 different species that have what he considers to be negative traits, right? Their meanness, their cunning, their guile, their brutality, right? So if you read just that, you might think that Epictetus, only has bad things to say about animals, but that's not going to be the case. Another negative example isn't the one who's harmed, the one who suffers the most pitiful and deplorable fate, the one who turns from a human being into a wolf, a snake, or a wasp. So he likens Medea to something like a viper, right? She ceased to be a human being. Another text from Epictetus, likewise, the presence of nose and eyes aren't enough for us to tell whether someone is a human being, but we need to check whether he has human judgments. Here's someone who doesn't listen to reason and doesn't understand when he's been proved wrong. He's a donkey or an ass. Here's one whose self-respect has perished. He's a complete waste of space, a sheep rather than a human being. Here's one who's looking to meet someone and then to kick and bite him. So he's not a sheep or a donkey, but some wild beast, right? So these are different character types that Epictetus is depicting as typical of certain non-human animal species, right? Through these negative lenses. Epictetus again. So make sure you never act like a wild beast. If you do, you stop being human and you're not fulfilling your potential. Make sure that you never act like a sheep, because that's another way to stop being human. What is it to act like a sheep? When we act to satisfy our belly or our genitals, when we act without purpose, when we act grubbily or heedlessly, where have we sunk? To the level of sheep. What have we destroyed? Our rational faculty. So here Epictetus is again pushing hard on the bifurcation, the dichotomy between humans as paradigmatically rational and beasts, certain beasts, whether domesticated or wild, as lacking that autonomy, that purposiveness, right? If you're only concerned about food and drink and sex, then you're acting in a beast-like way. Why? Because that's what beasts do. They eat, they procreate, predators prey on their prey, and domesticated animals, they're all timid and easily intimidated and that sort of thing. So the passage continues, when we act aggressively with intent to injure, passionately and impetuously, where have we sunk? To the level of wild beasts. And while some of us are large beasts, others are vicious and small and make us long to be eaten by a lion. These are all ways in which we destroy our potential as human beings, right? So these texts suggest that our human potential, since it's reason, is to develop that reason and perfect it into all the virtues. And virtues are going to allow us to live cooperatively and not to injure others, but to help each other and live harmoniously in communities with each other, fulfilling our social roles, our roles in the family, our roles as citizen, and get rid of the negative passions, right? The passions of fear, and anger and greed and that sort of thing, right? And here's the emperor, right? Marcus Aurelius. This is a long text. I apologize for this, right? But it has an important idea in it, right? So Marcus, as we know, or as many of us know, he had some issues with sleeping. He had to take Theriac to deal with some sort of digestive disorder. His physician Galen gave him this weird brew of chemicals or herbs, and it also contained opium. So Marcus had trouble sometimes getting enough sleep. He suffered from insomnia, so he would take the Theriac, but then he would get drowsy during the day. So it was difficult for him. So he had trouble getting out of bed. Who doesn't sometimes, right? So he writes, at dawn, when you're reluctant to get up, have this thought readily available. I have work to do as a human being, and that's why I'm getting up. Do I still resent it if I'm on my way to do the work for which I was born and for the sake of which I was brought into the world? Or is this what I was made for? To huddle under blankets and keep warm. But it's really nice. Snuggle under your covers, right? He says, so is pleasure. Is pleasure what you were born for? And in general, was it for feeling, not for doing, right? Is your purpose as a human being to feel good or to have certain feelings rather than others? Or is it for doing stuff, getting stuff done? Can't you see plants, sparrows, ants, spiders, and bees all doing their own work and playing their part in the world's order? And are you then reluctant to do human work? So Marcus looks out to nature and he recognizes that plants have a thing to do. Plants are living things that turn to the sun, take in our carbon dioxide, right? He didn't know that, but right. But he observes plants taking in sunshine and water and nutrients from the soil and growing and blooming and flowering, right? And reproducing their kind. So plants have tasks to do, and so do sparrows, right? The nest isn't going to build itself. Feeding the young isn't going to happen on its own. Sparrows got to go out there, get the materials to build their nest, fly around, scout around, take care of the young. Ants live in colonies. They take care of the colony. That's one big kind of intelligent organism, right? The hive mind, right? And bees are a popular example among all the ancients as members of a community that work together, right? Spiders making their webs and so forth. So Marcus recognizes all of these insects and animals and even plants do their job to contribute to the functioning of nature. So care for offspring, as I mentioned, is an important behavior of animals. Epictetus decries the audacity of Epicurus for saying that we shouldn't raise children. Epictetus teaches, are people as foolish as sheep? Sheep don't abandon their offspring. Or are they as savage as wolves? Wolves don't abandon their offspring either. Right? So even having criticized sheep for some of their behaviors and wolves for some of their behaviors, there wouldn't be a next generation of sheep and wolves unless sheep and wolves took care of their offspring. And this is an admirable behavior that they have, right? So the top text is a little small for me to read there. Right. And so now we turn to Seneca. Seneca thinks the animals are more admirable than we are because they manage pleasures better, right? They don't become gluttonous or overweight or starve themselves and become emaciated if it's, within their power to get the food they need. They limit their desires to their needs. That's a key thing, right? They live without wickedness or deceit. They quickly overcome grief, worry, and disturbance, according to Seneca. They lack anger. They don't harbor malice. They have magnanimity and hold no grudges, or at least some of them do, and they treat their offspring fairly. So let's look at some of those texts. He writes, I don't even know what limits to observe in eating and drinking, something the very animals recognize by their feeling of fullness. To this day, I do not know the capacity of my own stomach. So in Seneca's time, if you were a wealthy patrician, boy, those Romans, they could really throw big parties and do a lot of eating and drinking, right? And we know about the vomitoriums, right? Where some would use a feather to tickle the back of their throat after they'd eaten a full meal so they could vomit it up and then go back to the table and eat some more, right? This is not a behavior of non-human animals. And animals don't do that, right? Seneca notes animals partake of food more eagerly, right? So they have a good appetite. They eat when they're hungry and then they tuck in. They're less exhausted by sexual intercourse. They have greater and more consistent strength. It follows that they are much happier than humans, for they live without wickedness or deceit. They have a greater and easier capacity for pleasure, and they enjoy those pleasures with no fear of shame or regret. So that's picking up on Epictetus's earlier point, right? Animals don't feel shame. They don't have a sense of shame like we do. Well, what does that indicate? Does that indicate that we're more virtuous than them, or are they more virtuous than us? They have nothing to be ashamed of, right? This is what Seneca is suggesting here. And so this is the view known as animalitarianism. Animalitarianism, or theoreophily, the fancy words for the view that non-human animals are happier than human beings. They're happier than we are. They don't have therapists, right? They don't suffer from alcoholism. They don't plunge into despair as we do. Okay, another long text. Seneca writes, in the case of mute animals, see how agitated their grieving is and yet how short-lived. With cows, their bellowing is heard for 1 or 2 days, and with mares, their erratic, demented charging around lasts no longer. When wild animals have followed the tracks of their cubs and wandered all through the forests, when they have returned repeatedly to their ransacked lairs, they extinguish their rage within a short time. Birds squawk around their empty nests with loud shriek, but in a moment they fall silent and resume their flight. No animals mourn their offspring for long, apart from human beings. They, meaning we, encourage our own grief. And the duration of our affliction depends not on what we feel, but on what we decide. So this is from the work Consolation to Marcia, where Seneca is arguing that it's natural for humans to experience grief when a loved one dies, but our challenge as Stoics is to moderate that grief and move on, not to dwell on, not to intensify it. And here he's suggesting that some people decide to intensify and prolong their grief unnecessarily, and that's bad. That's contrary to reason and contrary to virtue. So it's contrary to nature for human beings. Nepotism and bias are human failings, according to Seneca. So he's arguing against that because it's unjust, right? Nepotism is unjust, and unfair bias is not virtuous. Within the family, does any parent make such unfair estimations as to love a healthy child more than a sick one? Or a fine, tall son more than a short or middle-sized child? Wild beasts do not draw distinctions among their cubs. When they lie down to nurse, they feed them all alike. Birds distribute equal shares of food to all their nestlings. So again, we have an example of at least one species. He doesn't specify which species of wild beasts, but sort of generally wild beasts. They feed all of their offspring equally. Sometimes human beings show unfair partiality to some of their offspring over others. And what about war? Who conducts war? Only one species, ours. Human beings are the gentlest species. And when he says that, what he means is we can be the gentlest species when we're virtuous. The virtuous human being is the gentlest animal, right? So human beings are the gentlest species, generally speaking, But we are not ashamed to enjoy homicide, to wage war and pass it on to our children over generations, right? Although even wild animals devoid of speech maintain mutual peace. They only kill when they're cornered, or they have to because they're predators and they have to eat and feed their young. So they seek food, but they don't wage war. They don't kill unnecessarily, according to Seneca, right? And most of our contemporary ethology bears that out. There's some rare exceptions, but as a general rule, non-human animals don't tend to kill on this for unless they need it to survive, basically, right? He judges the cruelty and bloodlust of human tyrants to far exceed the savagery of lions, bears, snakes, and the fiercest non-human animals if they were our rulers. Those creatures bereft of reason, indicted, and condemned by us on the charge of being monsters, keep from harming their own. Even among animals, being of the same species brings security, whereas the frenzy of human savages is not restrained from attacking even close connections. And again, we can think of, mountain goats or bull elephants, right? Sometimes these alpha males in a certain species, they'll fight with each other. They don't fight to the death. They just fight for dominance. And then the loser goes off and licks his wounds, right? So human beings, we do fight to the death, unfortunately. Seneca says, noble beasts show mercy to their foes, harassing those who have cast themselves at your feet and tearing at them with your teeth. That's the behavior of beasts. And not even noble beasts at that. Elephants and lions pass by the animals they lay low. It's the ignoble beast, the lowly beast, that keeps at them. And this is from his work on mercy, on clemency, right? Which he wrote for his mentee, Nero, who was short on mercy, right? Some of these Roman emperors were really quite merciless. And Seneca, as his advisor to Nero, is trying to teach him that mercy is a virtue. Clemency is a virtue. Being all powerful, like a Roman emperor, doesn't mean that you need to squash those people who might annoy you or say critical things about you, right? Or who you perceive to be threats. So Seneca actually sees magnanimity in some wild animals. Water break. Many people, while taking vengeance, have let trivial wrongs get more deeply under their skins. The great and notable man, the magnanimous person, is the one who, like a great beast, listens without concern to small dogs yapping. Right? So we can see the stag, right, who's being hunted, and you got all the dogs going after the stag, and the stag is quietly defending itself while the little dogs are yapping. So Seneca thinks that only human beings relish indulging in harming their own kind, right? It's a mistake to trust the faces of the people you meet. They look like human beings, but have the character of wild animals, similar to the earlier Epictetus passage, right? They might look human, but they have beast-like vices inside of them. Except that with animals, it is the first attack that is the most dangerous. They don't pass people by and then turn and pursue them. They are never provoked to do injury except under compulsion, when hunger or fear forces them to fight. The human being, on the other hand, positively likes to destroy another. Right? Schadenfreude. This is a human vice. Right? Taking pleasure in somebody else's pain and suffering. Non-human animals don't exhibit that vice at all, according to Seneca, right? They don't seek to destroy members of other species. So back with Epictetus now. Epictetus, right, for him, freedom is sort of the paramount value. That's one way of reading Epictetus's brand of Stoicism, right? It's all about freedom, right? Freedom from anger, fear, grief, envy, jealousy, pettiness, right? to free oneself from these negative emotions, you have to develop the right kind of outlook, the right kind of understanding, true beliefs about what's good, what's bad, and what's neither good nor bad, right? And so it's remarkable that Epictetus exalts a couple of species of non-human animals because they display a fierce attachment to their own freedom. So he writes in the Discourses, consider how we apply the idea of freedom to animals. There are tame lions that people cage, raise, feed, and take with them wherever they go. Yet who will call such a lion free? The softer its life, the more slavish it is. No lion endowed with reason and discretion would choose to be one of these pet specimens. The birds above us, when they are caught and raised in a cage, will try anything for the sake of escape. Some starve to death rather than endure their condition. Those that survive, barely, grudgingly, wasting away, lie off in an instant when they find the least little opening to squeeze through. So great is their need for their native freedom. So strong the desire to be independent and unconfined. Well, what's wrong with you here in your cage? What a question. I was born to fly wherever I like, to live in the open air, to sing whenever I want. You rob me of all this and then ask, what's wrong with you? That's the same Epictetus who was talking about the vices, right? The vices, don't be depraved like a worm, he says, right? Don't be like a wild beast tearing at your foe. Don't be aimless like a sheep and only concerned with your belly and your genitals, right? Don't act like beasts. Except birds are really admirable because they value their freedom so much. Why are human beings willing to enslave themselves to their wicked impulses, right? To their appetites for food, drink, sex, money, whatever, right? We give our freedom away all too often. But birds don't do that. And lions aren't made to be pets. Lions are not to be domesticated, right? That denatures them. That's contrary to their specific excellence, the excellence of their species, which is to be a predator, king of the beasts, as we say, right? So again, he returns to the birds for moral exemplars for his students to emulate, and he respects crows and ravens for their ability to be resilient and adapt and not attached to one nest in one place. So he writes, have you been enjoying everything, places, people, lifestyle, on the assumption that they'd be there for you forever? Talking to his students now, right? And now you, my students, sit and weep because it's no longer the same people who pass before your eyes. And you're not living in the same places. Because Epictetus' students, most of them are from Rome, right? They're adolescents from Rome. They've traveled to Greece and the city of Nicopolis, where Epictetus' school is, and they get homesick. And they whine about missing Rome and their parents and their friends there. Epictetus doesn't have time for this. He's scolding them for this, right? He says, coming here, yeah, suffering from that homesickness, yes, this is what you deserve, to be more wretched than ravens or crows. They can fly wherever they want, move their nests, cross seas, and they do so without moaning or missing what they had before. Crows and ravens don't get homesick and moan and groan about it. Epictetus's adolescent students do. And so he's scolding them for being, and they have reason, right? His students are 13 and older, which means that according to Stoic doctrine, they're rational beings. And yet with their superior power of reason, they suffer from a vice and moan and groan and are what? Less happy than the ravens and crows that what? Roll with the punches. They got to move and relocate. They do it and they don't moan and bitch about it, right? So here's our discussion question, right? How can observing animals help us recognize and reduce our own vices?